Hello all and welcome to today's seminar by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is Xavier Jara and I'm a research officer at the IAI. I am extremely honored and pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled The Dynamics of Lifetime Incomes in France, which is part of IAI's seminar series. Today's speaker is Professor Cecilia García-Peñalosa. Cecilia is Professor of Economics at the Aix-Marseille School of Economics and holds the chair on gender, growth and development at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. May I ask our online audience to keep yourselves muted? And as usual, there will be a chance to ask questions to the speakers at the end of the presentation. So the floor is yours, Cecilia, and many thanks for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. So what I'm going to present is joint work with Bertrand Garbanti, Vladimir Péché, and Frédéric Savignac. And I need to apologize already. This is very much work in progress. So I actually did do a few new graphs and tables to make things look nice about 2 weeks ago. But this data is data that we don't access directly. It's in a computer at the National Institute in France. An output needs to be checked by somebody in the institute. And so May is bank holiday time in France. And by this morning, I still haven't received the nice tables. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working time, and I can see the effects of working time patterns in France. So I don't need to give much of an introduction for this audience. There's a vast literature that in inequality that has looked at the dynamics of earnings inequality in Western economies. And as you all know, has found that increases in inequality in many countries. There's literature more on the macro side that has also looked at the dynamics of average or median earnings that has found some somewhat surprising patterns, notably in the US, the stagnant earnings that have been observed for an average stagnant, I should say, average or median earnings that have been observed in a number of countries. Now, all this work, of course, extremely important, is based on snapshots of earnings at a particular point in time. And so we're given an average earning in a particular year or a distribution of earnings in a particular year. And as we look over time, the composition of the population may change, and some of the individuals in the sample will be the same with different earnings realizations over time. But as economists, many of the aspects that we study in macroeconomies, we look at many decisions, education decisions, consumption decisions made by households. They tend not to be based, or not totally based, on current income, but on some form of lifetime income or lifetime earnings. And so what we want to do in this paper is to see to what extent are we able to examine those patterns by looking at the dynamics of lifetime earnings. Why is this important? Well, because lifetime earnings, and in particular lifetime earning inequality, is going to be shaped by two things: by the cross-sectional inequality, the distribution at a particular point in time, but also the degree of earning mobility that individuals are going to experience over the lifetime. And just to give an example, if these are the dynamics of earnings for two individuals over the lifetime, we have, this is the average individual, and this one I actually went and checked, is a distribution that you get for football players that looks something like that. Then, of course, measuring dispersion at a particular point in time between those two individuals in their 40s or in their late 20s is going to be much higher levels of inequality than if we consider their entire lifetime earnings. So what we want to do is simply to not. Why am I not achieving? 2 years later, I'll use it. So what we do is look at how lifetime earnings have evolved. Now, there's A little bit of work on this, and in particular, there's a recent paper by Gouvenet and a number of cohorts that does exactly that. So they compute lifetime earnings using fiscal data for the US, and they have cohorts that entered the labor market between 1957 and 83, and they're going to see how both inequality and the median evolve over time for these different cohorts. This kind of analysis is not easy to reproduce because data availability, because you need information on the entire careers of individuals to compute these lifetime earnings. And French data is going to allow us to do that. And so the basic question that we're going to ask is, let's do the same exercise that they do and see if we find in France the same patterns that they have obtained for the US. This is interesting, in our opinion, for a number of reasons. The US and France are very different countries. France has more moderate cross-sectional earnings growth than in the US. Earnings inequality has remained relatively stable in France, although there has been an increase at the top. But then also the structure of the labor market is very different. The minimum wage in France is very important, is binding. It changes over time, but it usually covers about 20% of those employed. A very large fraction of employees are paid the minimum wage. And then gender patterns, as you will see, gender differences are very important in Gouvenet et al.'s paper. Gender patterns in France have traditionally followed the different dynamic. More married women work than in the US. Unemployment segregation has traditionally been less marked in France than in the US. So a number of aspects that make us think ex ante that France is likely to be different from the US. So what we're going to do is that we're going to exploit the data set that has been used quite a lot. It's a firm data set for French firms. I'll give you more details about it, that will follow individuals throughout their entire careers. And we're going to be able to compute lifetime earnings for individuals starting with the labor market entry in 1967. I'm going to define labor market entry as the year in which individuals are 25, like Gouvenet et al. Do for the US. So this is going to be, our first cohort is going to be individuals born in 1950. We're going to have a more or less comparable, not identical, comparable time span to that for the US. And so we're going to be able to compare the patterns across the two countries. We're also going to have some advantages that today I'm not going to exploit much because we're, as I was saying, this is very much work in progress. One is that we have information on working time. The US data is fiscal data, is social security data. So they have the social security payments in a particular year and the associated earnings, but we don't know how much time individuals have worked. Our firm data is going to allow us to look at how many weeks in the year individuals work, are they full-time, are they part-time, etc. And the second thing that we've started doing is that we have merged the firm database with the censuses. And so we're going to have individual information, where you are, were you ever married, children, and things like geographical location that we're beginning to exploit. For example, is the pattern of earnings different for people born in Paris and people born elsewhere in France? And so with this data set, we're going to be able to look at how inequality in lifetime earnings has evolved over time. And the main two things that I'm going to do today are going to be compare it to the US, but also think a little bit and get your feedback on that, how inequality of lifetime earnings compares with what we find in the cross-section. In terms of related literature, as well as Gouvenet et al., there are a few earlier papers that use relatively short horizons to compute some measure of lifetime earnings. They do some simulations of longer term patterns and so on, but there is very little done so far. And Gouvenet et al. Have two key findings that we're going to see if they're reproduced in time. median lifetime earnings have been virtually flat in the US for the cohorts that they studied. That these flat median earnings are the combination of declining median earnings for men and sharply increasing median earnings for women. And so we're going to see what the French data says. And then, of course, as you would expect, given what we know from the cross-section, inequality in lifetime earnings has increased markedly for the population as a whole, but also for the two gender groups. The paper is also related to a number of papers for France using the same kind of data for other labor market questions. Yes.
So just a quick silly question from a development economist, which is that I always assume administrative data in Latin America, we exclude the informal sector, which is huge. Administrative data in the US and France cover everyone. But actually, is that true? I mean, is now with, I don't know, Uber drivers and the gig economy, I mean, do we know anything about, is everybody covered in the social security data in the US and in your data in France?
So in the US, it's everybody who pays social security. So that's the determining factor. So in principle, yes, but there are issues with the self-employed who may or may not pay social security in the US. In our case, the self-employed don't appear in the data because this is firm data. So what we have is the universe of employees in France. From the census, we have identified people who are self-employed. And so we can, at least we're going to be able to control for self-employment, even though we will not have the earnings of the self-employed. So that's...
What share of the labor force in France are they?
In France, this is very small. It is about 3–4%. Because given how the social security system works in France, individuals who in the UK or the US would be self-employed, an architect usually pay themselves a salary throughout their lifetime in order to be contributing to pensions and so on. But I'll say more about the data and what we're missing in the data.
Related to Nico's question, I don't know the current situation with the database, but a few years ago, the French data did not include civil servants, but the US data do include civil servants.
So we're missing, okay, I'll answer this by, skip the contribution, by moving to the data. So let me start with the data and I'll answer your question in the next slide. So this data set, as I was saying, it comes most of it from the firm. And what we have is individuals born in the first 4 days in October of even years. And so this is data that covers all firms, irrespective of the size, because any firm, no matter how small it is, needs to report information on any employer that it has born in those 4 days of the year. We're going to have 11 cohorts entering the labor market between 67 and 87. So born between 1942 and, between 1942 and 1962. And we're going to have yearly earnings as our key variable of interest. And so to ask your questions, we're missing civil servants at the beginning of the period. We have them for 2/3 of the period. What I'm going to show you today excludes civil servants, and we're working now on robustness for the cohorts where we have the two to see how much inequality changes. But I don't have the results yet, so I cannot answer. Our expectation is that including civil servants will tend to reduce inequality. We'll see. And then this is civil servants, but not government employees who are not civil servants. So in France, there's a lot of public employment, which is contractual, not civil servants. And so those individuals are in the database. What I'm going to show you today is going to consider an individual's career as the period between ages 25 and 55, so 31-year period. Again, in the pipeline, there is robustness to consider entire careers because we have all the information from the first student job that the individual gets until retirement. We have all the employment spells that they have had. And then again, in terms of comparison, we do a certain amount of trimming of the data to remove individuals whose incomes are very low because they're not sufficiently attached to the labor market. So a limitation, as I was saying, is that we have no information for the self-employed, and so we're now using the census to identify if individuals were self-employed in a particular year, and we'll try to control for that in some way. One advantage of the data compared to the US data is that there's no top coding. This is firm data, so no matter how high your income is going to be reported by the firm. Cuban and Italy use social security data, so they only know the income on which social security contributions are paid, and since this income is capped, then the earnings that they observe are capped as well. So our results will be a better approximation of actual inequality than theirs. Sorry?
You catch your footballs.
Exactly, and we're catching the footballers. There was a question at the back.
This might be a very silly question from an 18-year-old, but did you include assets which individuals had, like for instance, they were getting dividends? No.
No, these are exclusively labor earnings. So we're missing all that aspect. So this is not the income of the individual, it's just what's coming from their labor market.
Outdated. A few years ago, the French data was not top coded, but was top coded by the threshold of the social security contributions. So they have solved that problem, that they have redone the whole database.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, so these are the earnings
As paid by the employee.
by the employee. I don't know, and we should check if going back in time, because they start with reporting in 67. I haven't checked how much correction there has been. My assumption was that the firms were reporting actual earnings and that it was the Statistical Institute that was top coding them so that they had the information. I don't expect they would have gone back to firms because many of them, of course, wouldn't exist.
For comparison, it's useful if the Spanish database is top coded by the social security threshold, not because of the data.
Yes, this is something that that is also in our to-do list to try to make it more comparable. Okay, so our income concept is very simple, is labor income of employed individuals. And so we're going to look at all the 31 years between age 25 and age 55, deflate them, of course, so that they are real earnings, and divide them by 31. So it's the annualized labor earnings of the individual. So the figures that I'm going to be giving you is that. And so for many individuals, there will be many zeros. For many women, there will be many zeros. And as we'll see, this is going to be an important part of the dynamics.
Cecilia, does anybody ever use a discount rate when creating?
No, I've
motivated at the beginning is people making choices on the basis of.
Yes. The problem is which discount rate do you use? Do you use the interest rate? So, but yes, this is of course an important issue and an issue that becomes very important when I'll show you in 2 or 3 slides the age patterns that we find in the data.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm not familiar at all with lifetime earnings, but in the initial slide, you showed an ever increasing curve. That does seem to go counter to a lot of comparisons with, yes, and I realize you're taking workers now, with price parity and the actual power of what an income does. And if we're talking about inequality, somehow I haven't heard anything that's factored into this. Or should it be?
Okay, so this is the pattern for over an individual's lifetime. So often, not always, but often there's a decline in later years, and then individuals retire. So this is the individual's income. What you're talking about, if you want, is if I understand correctly, is the income, the average income in the country as a whole, and how it could go on, how it could increase forever. Here, we're not going to be thinking about that. This is, of course, a very important question as a measure of prosperity.
But it's not your question.
But
Okay.
we'll focus on individuals, inequality across individuals, and our contribution here is to say what we tend to do because of data description, data restrictions, which is take a snapshot of all the people in this room at a particular moment in time, is not so good proxy of what happens when we consider the entire lifetime of the individual. Okay, so just to give you the background to what we're trying to do, this is the data from Gouvenin et al.'s paper. These are their cohorts starting in 67. Their data actually starts a little bit earlier, but for comparison with ours, we start in 67. And we've got females and males, and the result that attracted a lot of attention, the fact that median lifetime earnings for men have declined considerably for those 20 cohorts. For women, there has been a substantial increase from about $17,000 to about $23,000. So an increase of, I'll give you the exact figures in a second. What do we find in France? Well, these are our lifetime earnings in gray for the entire population, red women and blue men. And so the first thing that we find is that men have not done as well as average incomes, of course, but there has been a slight increase over time with some fluctuations for cohorts entering the labor market around the oil crisis, which in France were very severe in terms of unemployment. We see in the data clearly that those people are out of, those cohorts spend considerable periods out of the labor market. Women, they experience an increase in their lifetime earnings, sharper than men, but no way as large as the one that we saw in the US. So our first interpretation is the median male worker is not our, I always have problems with this. So cohorts, different cohorts of men, as they've entered the labor market successively between 67 and 87, have been doing a little bit better than previous cohorts, with women catching up a little bit with men, but no decline for men as in the US, and not the sharp increase that they find for women. Yes.
Sorry, just to be picky, but since you drew attention to 1973, another interpretation of that graph is that whatever growth there was up until the cohort that entered in 73, and then after that, all you've done is catch up back to 73.
Yes, it is. Yes, you're right. The question is, this was a shock. GDP fell for a few years. So is this growth or is this catching up?
Still better than the US, because in the US it's falling.
Sure. And sorry, I keep going. I mean, in the US, of course, you have also the decline starting around the oil crisis, but it keeps going now. The next thing I want to show you are age profiles. So bear with me a moment. This is a somewhat complicated graph. So here I have individuals entering in 67 when they were 25. And then this line follows them over time. So the blue square there is their average lifetime earnings at the point in which they're 35. So average between age 25 and 35. And then the green triangle is average between 25 and 45. And then the gray one is at 55. Okay. So the gray one is basically reproducing what we saw in the previous graph, going up, then declining, and then going up again. But something that is interesting for us in this picture is how the age profiles have changed over time. If you see in green, so at age 45, we have more or less the pattern that we find overall. But at 25, what we find are sharp increases at the beginning of the period and a sharp decline for the cohorts entering the labor market after 77. And so, maybe going back to your question, Stephen, this is something that I think we need to explore more, because even if individuals have, a moderate growth over their lifetime earnings, their possibilities to invest, to buy housing, to be geographically mobile are very much affected by their incomes earlier in life. And so this pattern seems to be telling us that in younger cohorts, individuals experience lower entry incomes, lower entry earnings, but faster growth over time, which can have important implications for their possibilities over the lifetime. We have done this so far, but I think it's a question that we need to look more into to see what we can get out of this pattern.
So when you say faster growth over time, is that because the line that goes up from one of the red dots is steeper towards the right hand side?
Yeah, exactly. So this individual and this cohort had the same median earning, the same average median earning. No, this is average, so it's median across individuals, but this average over time. So the same average earning at age 35, but one had a lower, this one had a lower one to start with, and so faster growth.
55 is upward sloping, almost.
Yes, there's a little bit, it's quite, it's also a question of scale. So it does fall a little bit for the cohorts entering during the oil crisis, and then it goes up.
If you run a simple earnings regression Mincer equation, has returns to experience increased over this period?
We have started running regressions, and I'm going to show you a little bit of results on that, on working time.
You see what I'm saying, right?
Yes, I can't.
The gap between 25 and 55 has increased.
Sure. So we cannot, what we're going to do is to run a serial regression for lifetime earnings, which is different. So there we cannot include age, obviously, because it's the same for everybody. What we haven't done, but what we could do is actually compute working time and include working time to see if this would be true experience. Your question is, in the cross-section standard, which regressions have returns to experience increased in France over the period? I don't know. Returns to education have, but I don't know whether returns, I can't remember whether returns to experience have.
There's actually, I remember a paper, I don't remember now the authors, that found declining returns to experience in France, but it may have been a different period or whatever. I will not who did it.
Okay. I'll look into that.
I looked at it because in Brazil it was falling, and another place where it was falling was
France. Okay, well, we should check that. Okay, and I'm going to come back to this, but of course, a very important aspect of lifetime earnings is the fact that people are out of the labor force or not employed in certain periods of life. So here I have done two things. On the left, I have the percentage of years out of those 31 that the individuals work. You see for males in blue, what we were saying before, the high unemployment. So employment is increasing to start with, and then employment rates for men fall during the oil crisis periods and then pick up again. And for women, what we see is a sharp increase in employment for the first cohorts that then starts stabilizing a bit later on, as we would have expected, given all we know about female labor force participation. And so here on the right, I'm computing again median lifetime incomes, but in two different ways. Then let me get this right. So the gray and the green lines are what I'm calling the intent, no, the red and the blue and the red are what I'm calling the extensive margin, if you want. Those are the figures that I've seen here before. I sum up all the earnings and divide them by 31, irrespective of how many years they have worked. And then the gray and the green, what I do is that I take all the positive earnings, sum them up and divide them by the number of years in which I observe positive earnings. And so, as expected, those two lines are higher, your average earnings are higher if I don't take into account the zeros. The patterns are relatively similar, and so, but the gaps are quite large. And so employment, access to employment, both for men and for women, seems to be an important aspect in understanding what has happened. Okay, so let's move to inequality. So far, I've been giving you the median. What I've got here, how do I get, let me see if we can get. Read the title. Thank you. So here I just have selected percentiles by cohort and by gender. So, and I apologize, this is men and this is women. And what you see, particularly notable, is that at the bottom of the distribution, there hasn't been much growth, but not the declines that are observed in the US for men. Somewhat faster growth for women than for men, and for men, growth at the top of the distribution for the younger cohorts in our sample. Let me show you some figures of inequality that are easier to interpret and that we can compare with the US. So here I have the cumulative growth of lifetime earnings for the cohorts that we are considering. So the median is what we were initially focusing on. So for men between entering 67 and 87, there has been a 10% increase growth, 18% for women. And if we compare that with the US, we find this large decline for men by 10 percentage points and this massive increase for women, so twice as much growth for women in the US than in France. You've got the means at the top. In France, the mean, well, for women is notably close to the median. For men, the mean is actually a bit lower than the median. And in the US, as we would expect, given what we know about inequality, much faster increases for the mean than for the median. And then I've got the two top percentiles, P10, P90, P99. Do I need to explain what I mean by that to anybody? So this is the income of those in the top 10% of the distribution, in the bottom 10% of the distribution, in the top 10% of the distribution, and in the top 1% of the distribution. And again, the comparison with the US is striking. P99, so the top 1% actually over the entire period we consider for all those cohorts has slightly declined in France, while in the US for men there has been an increase of 50%. But even with P90, we find a considerable difference between men and women, between men in France and men in the US. This is not so much the case for women. Yes.
Now I got confused. Is that the actual percentile or is that an average of the top 1%?
This is on average in the top 1%.
But not the 99%.
No, no.
In the case of the US, they can make no distinction between full-time and part-time workers.
No.
And in your number here, you are adjusting by working time? Not yet.
Not yet. And I'll show you a little bit on that, but so far, no. So we're doing exactly what
But you can show the evolution of the part-time working time.
Yes, and I will.
And they did some imputation in the US for hot coding. Presumably must have for the P99.
No, they calculate it out of the distribution of earnings that they have. I will check again. I will double check the working paper version with all the details, but my understanding is that they don't. These are the dynamics of some of the ratios that I was giving you earlier. So This is again men and women, P90 to P50, so the ratio between the top and the middle of the distribution. This fits existing evidence, I'll show you in a second, for the cross-section in France, with inequality first declining and then increasing for men, and then for women, what am I saying? Sorry, I beg your pardon. This is the P90, P50, and this is the P50, P10. So inequality at the top, inequality at the bottom of the distribution. So here is the downward sloping trend that then increases. You can see that inequality for men has changed less than overall inequality. So partly it's driven by what has been happening to women wages and the increase in inequality within the group of women. And this is inequality at the bottom of the distribution, relatively stable for men. And the overall dynamics that we see in gray are very much driven by what has been happening to women at the bottom. And here, of course, a very important factor, Facundo, is what you were saying. Women are working more years, and then the change that, in fact, what we find in France is that there has been an increase in part-time employment by women. So there are more women working part-time in the younger cohorts than in the older cohorts. And here, again, another measure of inequality, P90, P10, with, for men, the decline and the increase observed in other work. I also have the Gini coefficient for the two gender groups and the average. A decline and an increase. The increase is particularly sharp for men towards the end of, for the younger cohorts that we observe, and this is something that we need to explore more to try to understand what is driving this very sharp increase in inequality for men. But the next thing I want to do is to compare what we're getting here with some cross-sectional information. So here we have computed using the same data, standard cross-sectional indices. We take individuals age between 25 and 55 in a particular year, and we compute the Gini coefficient. So this is reproducing what we find usually in the literature on inequality in France, with a decline initially stable and then some increase in more recent years. And so if I compare that to what I was getting before, sorry, so these were some of the graphs that I was trying to get with the same scale, and I haven't received them yet, but the decline in inequality here is very small. The Gini, I mean, you know, we haven't computed it, but maybe it's even statistically insignificant. The Gini coefficient is going from 34 to 33, and then, you know, yes, towards the end, it increases up to 37.5. Here, the decline in inequality goes from 39 to about 35. So clearly, much sharper, higher inequality in the cross-section and much sharper dynamics, but overall patterns that are more or less similar. So the next thing that we have done, and I really would like to get your input here, is to see if we can approximate somehow lifetime earnings inequality. So most of the time we don't have data on lifetime earnings. Here we do. Is there some period of time? Is there some age in which when we look at the cross-section, we're getting measures that give us similar dynamics? This is what we do here. So in gray, I have inequality. Here is at the bottom, so the P50, P10. Inequality of lifetime earnings, what we had seen so far. And the dashed lines are the same measure of inequality that we have computed by looking at a cross-section, where here we have, no, the blue is the earliest one. Here we have only the individuals aged between 25 and 35. Here, those aged between 35 and 45, and in green, those aged between 45 and 55. And so just eyeballing the data, something that to us seemed rather intuitive is that inequality between 45 and 55 captures better lifetime earnings inequality than if you look at younger cohorts. In particular, for the very young, it's not just that the level is different, which of course we would expect, but the dynamics are also very different. Well, for the older groups of individuals, they seem to be more similar. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be a pattern that is confirmed when we look at other things. Here, I have inequality at the top, P90, P50, again, in gray lifetime earnings and the 3 age groups. And here, the dynamics are relatively similar for all of them. This is partly because at the top, we find fewer people coming in and out of the labor market than at the bottom, but the level seems to be closer to that observed for the middle, call the middle age, 35, 45, for the group in the middle. And then, yes.
It might be interesting to change your age groups to have something that spans 45, I mean, it on either side. The reason I say that is related to the intergenerational income mobility literature, where people are bothered about the difference between transitory earnings in one generation versus another. And apart from averaging, people have also, there's a couple of influential papers using German data and American data that suggest that around age mid-40s, the snapshots basically capture lifetime earnings best. So it'd be intriguing to see whether or not something around.
Okay, so you're saying, I mean, one of the exits, the outputs I didn't get is by 5-year groups.
Sure.
So that's already coded. So it should arrive when the bank holidays stop. Okay, women next. So the same thing for women. Here I have inequality at the bottom, and you can see much sharper fluctuations here. Consistent, first we have a few women in the sample, but also the fact that we have lots of zeros for women, lots of years in which women don't work, and much more movement between full-time and part-time, and difficult to find a pattern here. The level seems to be closer to what we observe in the middle years, which are also years in which mothers are very actively engaged with child rearing and so on. So that seems to be capturing well. And you can see, interestingly, that here for women, inequality for young women is much higher, especially in later periods, because of the massive entry of highly educated women in the labor market for those cohorts that were very engaged in the labor market when they were young, and then they would drop out. And then inequality at the top for women, where again, as it happened for men, the dynamics seem to be captured well by the cross-section, and the level seems to coincide with what we observe for the 45, 55-year-olds.
The previous one was P50, P10.
Yes.
So wouldn't you expect the entry of all these educated women to show up more in the P90, P50 than here? I was thinking, my candidate explanation for why it was so much there was variations in the extensive margin, was the fact that there would be huge variation in how much they work at that age, because it's a sort of prime motherhood age, rather than the education, which I would have expected to show up higher up in the distribution.
I mean, we need to look at this, but French women, for the first cohorts, those that work are highly educated and work full-time and many years. So here we have the Marie Curies, the very highly motivated career women, contrary to the US, where what we observe in this period tend to be negatively selected women married to low-income men that need to work to supplement household income. And I have a figure later on. The proportion of part-time has increased for women over time very sharply. So this could be part of the story, but the education expansion has been massive in France for this cohort. I mean, these are cohorts that start finishing high school, which wasn't the case before.
One way to check is to do your intensive margin adjustment.
Yes, we can do that for that particular group. Okay. So the last thing, how am I doing? 5 more minutes? So the last thing that we've started doing is to run regressions of lifetime earnings, just as we would run standard wage regressions, and we exploit the matching between the firm data and the census. And so we can introduce controls such as the number of years worked, or the proportion of years worked, the proportion of years worked full-time versus part-time. We have information of the highest diploma. We've constructed a variable for having ever been married or having ever had children, place of birth that we're starting to exploit, and how much time you have worked in Paris, which is another variable, following Chetty and that kind of literature. Geography is something that we want to explore. And so what I'm going to show you is going to be a comparison with our earliest cohort. I should have written cohort, not year, 1967. And so we're going to run 2 regressions, lifetime earnings in time 0, with a set of characteristics x0, and we're going to get a set of coefficients b0, lifetime earnings in some other year t, with the characteristics of the working time, the education level, and so on in that year, and the coefficients in year t. And then I'm going to show you 2 graphs with some simulations, in which what we do is that we simulate lifetime earnings with the returns of cohort t, but the characteristics of the initial cohort, to get an idea of how much certain characteristics are explaining. So this is what we get in the first year, and the title is wrong. Sorry about that. In black is what we actually observe in the data. In terms, this is again, these are excuse me. I should have said before, these are mean lifetime earnings, not median. We're running a regression, so of course, our point of comparison is the mean, not the median. And in green, I have the effect of keeping education's level at the 1960 level. In red and blue, the effect of keeping constant either the share of years working full-time or the share of years working part-time. So something that surprised us a little bit is how working time matters. Here, there's a gap that appears between actual lifetime earnings and our counterfactual due to the fact, as I was saying, of high unemployment during the oil crisis. In more recent years, the number of or the amount of time spent working full-time doesn't seem to do much. But male part-time has appeared in our data for the younger cohorts. So we have seen an increase. Of course, this is very small, but there has been an increase in the share of men working part-time, and this has had an effect on their lifetime earnings. And I think that there's a question that is beginning to be asked. I've only seen it answered with German data about to what extent part-time is something that people want or is something that people do because they find no better jobs. And with men, the answer is not clear at all. Okay, and here I have the counterfactual keeping the distribution of education as it was in 67. And as we would have expected, a lot of the increase after the oil crisis is due to the expansion of qualifications. Women here. Again, in black, I have the actual dynamics of mean lifetime earnings. These are the 2 curves measuring, excuse me, the red is the curve measuring part-time, the blue is the curve measuring full-time. And so you can see that the 2 are going in different directions. The blue curve is telling us that part of the reason why women earn more is the fact that they are working more years in general and more years over their entire career. But the red one is indicating that there has been a deterioration in terms of the amount of part-time, that a lot of those women going into the labor market are now doing part-time jobs, and this would tend to have kept their earnings lower. And then, as is the case for men, in green, we have education, and a lot of the gap is explained by the increase in education. Okay, I think that was my last slide. So let me conclude with a little bit of time for discussion. So what we are trying to do with this paper is to look at the dynamics of lifetime earnings in France. I think we have an interesting fact in how different those dynamics are for the US. We don't find the decline that they find for men, and much more similar patterns for men and women than they find for the US. And some surprising results, as we saw with the age profiles, the fact that more recent cohorts find lower entry earnings and faster growth over their careers, which may have important implications for a number of welfare measures. In terms of inequality, not very surprisingly, we find lower inequality than in the US. We also find that inequality is lower when we look at lifetime earnings than at the cross-section. And then we have this question of, can we somehow approximate lifetime earnings inequality? And the graphs I have just shown you seem to indicate that this is quite hard, that it is not obvious which age group could be approximating that. Just focusing on older workers, we still need to do the 40-45 result as Stephen wants, but that there's not an obvious group in which we find similar dynamics. It depends on gender and on whether we're looking at distribution at the top or at the bottom. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Cecilia, for this great presentation. We can open the floor for questions now. Our online attendees can either use the raise hand function or paste their questions on the chat. Anyone? Let's start with the audience here. Yes.
I'm just wondering, do we have any comment on either within the cohorts or overall on death rates?
So no, here we only have individuals that are alive between age 25 and 55. So anybody who passes away during that period is not, we have removed from our data. Is in the data set, but we have removed them. Okay. This could be an issue. You could, if you tell me those at the bottom of the distribution have a lower probability of arriving to 55, so you're underestimating inequality, that's a valid concern, yes. Thank you. But we could check, this is a good idea from the census, we could check, yeah, we could check that.
Just to add to your references at the beginning, if you wanted to add some income references, it was lifetime stuff. There's been work done by, for example, Anders Björklund, Review of Income and Wealth 1993, and probably some others that do the same sort of things that you're doing. And I was just looking at the abstract, and things like, quote, it is income up to around age 30 that mainly explains the discrepancy between cross-sectional and lifetime income, and so on and so on. But anyway, it may have be stuff on earnings in there as well.
Okay, very good. That's
Probably the age is country specific.
Yeah, sure.
The point is more bolstering.
Yeah.
I don't want to only focus on the bloody USA.
Several times you mentioned the oil crisis as a pivotal moment, but it seems to me that, like, in terms of unemployment in France, the situation is kind of under control until the 1980s, and maybe most of the increase arrived in the 1980s. I think that the average unemployment rate doubled between the second part of the 1970s and the 1980s. So I was wondering, why do you insist so much on this specific moment?
We've looked at this quickly, but the 1970s seem to be a period in which unemployment increases for the very young. The people entering the labor market are not getting jobs.
Yes.
And so behind our reading is the scarring effect that this has. These are cohorts that came after les Trente Glorieuses, years in which people were getting jobs very quickly and for life. Suddenly, this doesn't happen for a number of cohorts, and these cohorts seem to have remained handicapped throughout their lifetime, because it could have been that unemployment affected everybody equally, so earnings didn't grow, but in the same way. And here we have these cohorts that are entering just at the time of the crisis that seem to be particularly damaged. Well, unemployment in the 80s, although of course it affects more the young than older workers, is less unevenly distributed.
The other question is that, like, so it's still the early 1980s. So my memories are good. I think it's the moment when the government decided to stop the strict indexation of wages on inflation. And I was wondering how do you see this in your results?
Let me go. Let me show you a graph. This is one. Yes, this is the one I have. Here I have, let me read this correctly. So lifetime earnings, which are in blue. I have two different deflators here. Just we wanted to check for comparison, but you can ignore the dashed line. So these are the lifetime earnings for males that we have been looking at. No, wait. Gross minimum wages. Did I give you? No. This is correct. What is not correct is the legend. I apologize for that. So these are my male lifetime earnings. In red, I have the minimum wage, and in gray, I have GDP per capita. Okay, and so here what you're saying is you're capturing this decline in the minimum wage here. And you can see that, of course, the minimum wage has been a force keeping earnings up, but lifetime earnings have grown a lot less fast than the minimum wage have, and of course, less than GDP per capita. Chico.
So obviously this is all descriptive, and in the description, this separation between extensive and intensive margin is key in your early. Did I understand correctly that you're using full-time and part-time at the moment as a placeholder, but that you want to use the hours data later?
We won't have the hours for everybody. So the data that is consistent is full-time, part-time, and that's the individual do overtime. So we will be able to have 3 dummies, but we will not be able to have consistent measures of hours for everybody throughout the time period, which is unfortunate. We have weeks work, so that's something.
Weeks is something.
Yeah. So we don't have, just because Gouvernemental, they have annual earnings. We have, they don't know how much the individual has worked during the year. We know how many weeks in the year the individual has been employed in each job, and we can follow somebody who changes job. And in fact, we sum the various jobs in the year if they have it. So we have weeks, and we have these 3 measures: part-time, full-time, and overtime.
And one other, your nice picture with the cohorts.
The
one that looks like on.
the age profiles.
Yeah.
So okay, the roadway. This one.
That one. So that's actually years now here, right? This is no longer cohorts, this is years at the horizontal axis.
No. These are cohorts. So this is the cohort entering in 67 when they were 25. And then here is the same cohort that they will be 35 in 77.
Right. So
No.
what's on the horizontal axis is the year.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Because you're following the cohort.
Yes.
My point then being, as well as looking across like that, which is giving you
Mhm.
over time, different cohorts at the same age.
Yes,
If you did it like this, you'd have the cross-sectional inequality as well, right?
yes,
You know, the
exactly.
cross-section, since you want to compare, it just struck me that it's a nice way to organize the thing, you know, you can look at the cohorts across ages and you can look at cross-section inequality. That's-
Yeah, that's a very nice idea. So we can, yeah, we can discuss it in both dimensions just from this picture.
Yeah.
Any final question? Otherwise, we can thank Cecilia again for coming to today's seminar. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you everybody in the audience for joining us, and until next time.